She was one of the first Latina stars in Hollywood, bold, brilliant, and unforgettable. So, how did Lupe Velez go from red carpets to becoming the punchline of a myth she never deserved? This is the real story behind the chaos, the headlines, and the truth Hollywood tried to erase. Born in chaos, a childhood shaped by revolution. Lupe Velez was born on July 18, 1908, in San Luis Potosi, Mexico. Her birth name was Maria Guadalupe Villalobos Velez. From the beginning, life around her was unpredictable. Her father, Jacobo, was a military officer who became deeply involved in the Mexican Revolution. He didn't leave the war behind when he came home. Instead, he brought his young daughter along on some of his missions. Lupe later described how those early experiences shaped her forever. As a child, she witnessed men getting shot. She saw horses collapse under fallen riders. She watched her father fight, and she saw others try to kill him. She saw him kill to survive. There was no sugarcoating those memories for her. In interviews, she often said that while American children were off to kindergarten, she was learning how to stay calm under fire. She carried the weight of those images into adulthood. She once said that those experiences were her first education. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply learned to live with it. In her words, she had no goosebumps, no fear. That was just life for her. The family's position in society only made the fall harder. They were once part of the Mexican elite, educated, well-dressed, and respected. Her mother, Josefina, had been an opera singer, and the family lived comfortably. But after the revolution broke out, things changed quickly. Her father's role in the war eventually took him away from home, and his absence created more uncertainty. Lupe grew up surrounded by instability. One day, they had servants and carriages. Next, they were struggling to make ends meet. The money started drying up after her father went missing during the war. At one point, he was even presumed dead. Lupe, still a child, had to adjust to the silence left behind and the financial pressure that crept in. Her family's pride clashed with reality. Many of her relatives refused to work, unwilling to give up their social status. But things weren't the same anymore. The war didn't care about last names or titles, and the old wealth didn't stretch as far as it used to. Living in post-revolutionary Mexico meant dealing with political chaos, economic struggle, and emotional wounds that lingered. For Lupe, that meant growing up in a world where people disappeared, homes became shelters, and the future felt uncertain. Her childhood wasn't soft or quiet. It was shaped by gunshots, grief, and grit. It's easy to think of stars as glamorous and untouchable, but Lupe didn't come from a golden childhood. She came from a war zone, and even though she later wore silk gowns and starred in Hollywood films, part of her never left the battlefield. As a result, Lupe developed a reputation for being tough and unpredictable. People thought her temper came from fame or pride, but it started way before that. It came from having to survive early on, before studios, before scripts, before the spotlight. She learned not to trust stability because it never lasted long. Even her relationships with people were shaped by that early instability. She once described how she always expected people to leave because that's what war taught her. People leave, people die. So when you have something, hold it close, and when you lose it, don't cry. Keep moving. People later called her fiery or dramatic, but they didn't see the child who had once watched her brother get thrown off a horse in a firefight. They didn't see the girl who rode next to her father through war-torn villages. They just saw the star on the screen. That early exposure to danger set a tone for Lupe's whole life. A firecracker in the convent. But before Lupe Velez became a famous face in Hollywood, she was just a teenage girl sent far from home to a convent school in San Antonio, Texas. Her family believed the strict rules and quiet routines would calm her rebellious streak. Teachers quickly discovered she didn't follow orders the way the other girls did. She disrupted class, argued back, and refused to blend in. When she misbehaved, and it happened a lot, she was punished with repetitive writing drills. Lupe spent hours scribbling lines like, "I must be good," across notebook pages, as if discipline could smooth out her sharp edges. But the convent couldn't tame her, and punishment never changed her spirit. She didn't learn how to obey. She learned how to outlast them. Life back home in Mexico was unraveling. Their upper-middle-class lifestyle collapsed and reality hit hard. Her mother, once a trained opera singer, couldn't make ends meet on her own. The rest of the family didn't jump in to help either. Many of them were too proud to work. So at a time when most girls were still focused on school, Lupe took charge. She left the convent and returned home to a family that needed support. She wasn't trained in business or skilled labor, but she had drive. She walked into a department store, applied for a job, and started working as a salesgirl. She stood behind the counter, selling clothes and helping customers, doing what she could to bring money into the household. It wasn't glamorous, but she didn't care. What mattered was getting her family through the crisis. Even while she worked to keep them afloat, something inside her refused to settle. The same fire that caused problems in the convent refused to die out. She had always been expressive, loud, and quick on her feet. And now, with no school holding her back and a world of adult responsibilities on her shoulders, she looked for an outlet. Performing came naturally to her. She began to take part in local theater productions and dance shows around her town. Her performances didn't look like those of a shy beginner. She wasn't polished or trained, but she had presence. The audience remembered her. There was something electric about her energy, something raw and impossible to ignore. She moved like someone who had something to prove because she did. She wanted more than just a paycheck. She wanted attention, she wanted control, and she wanted a better life for herself and her family. Her name began to travel through word of mouth. People who saw her perform told others. Shows that started small began drawing bigger crowds. Her act wasn't about perfect technique or refined talent. It was about attitude. She had charisma and emotion that filled every inch of the stage. Off stage, she still worked her day job and helped out at home. On stage, she transformed into someone entirely different, someone bold, funny, and magnetic. She didn't have a plan. She didn't know where any of it would take her. But every time she performed, it pulled her further from the department store counter and closer to the spotlight. Her acts in those small venues would later be described as the spark that lit her path to Hollywood. But at the time, she was just a teenage girl juggling grown-up responsibilities with big energy and a refusal to settle for anything ordinary. The truth is, Lupe Velez didn't start her journey on the movie lot or with an agent's phone call. She started in a quiet convent she tried to shake off. Behind a sales counter she tried to escape, and on a stage where she let everything out. The fire that made her unforgettable in front of a camera was the same one that burned through every step of her teenage years. And long before anyone in Hollywood said her name, Lupe Velez had already decided she wasn't going to play by anyone else's rules. Lights, camera, accent, Hollywood's double standard. She was still in her teens when she crossed the border from Mexico, and by the time she was 20, she landed her breakout role in The Gaucho, 1927, opposite screen icon Douglas Fairbanks. That film made her name familiar to American audiences. She moved fast, and the town took notice. Back in the silent film era, Lupe's energy spoke for itself. She didn't need to say a word to capture attention. Her facial expressions, her timing, her movements, everything worked on screen. But when Hollywood transitioned to talking pictures, it changed everything for her. For some actors, sound gave them more tools. For Lupe, it added a target to her back. Her thick Mexican accent became the focus in casting rooms. Studios didn't care that she was multilingual or that she'd trained in acting and dance. They only heard her voice and saw a chance to turn her into a one-dimensional character. Instead of writing better dialogue or letting her show range, producers leaned into stereotypes. Lupe was cast in roles that exaggerated her voice, made her sound less fluent than she was, and often gave her awkward or over-the-top lines meant to get laughs. She wasn't chosen to play everyday women or complex leads. She was hired to storm into scenes, say something spicy, and storm out again. These parts were written to highlight how different she sounded, not to show what she could actually do. In one film after another, she was made to act out a version of the fiery Latina, loud, jealous, dramatic, and unpredictable. The scripts pushed her into this narrow lane, and the studios doubled down on it because it sold tickets. Directors encouraged her to play up the emotion and deliver lines with a heavy accent. They wanted volume and spectacle, and when Lupe did exactly what they asked, they labeled her too much, too wild, too bold, too foreign. This became a cycle. Every new movie made it harder for Lupe to break free. Casting directors only remembered the exaggerated performances, never what was behind them. She tried to push for different kinds of roles, but she wasn't given the same chances that other actresses had. There was no room for growth. She'd become a brand, not an artist. It didn't help that critics and journalists at the time often described her characters and personality as one and the same. There was no separation between who she played and who she was. Her real identity got buried under the roles she was forced to take. Some actors in Hollywood were able to experiment with different parts, but for Lupe, her accent set the boundaries. It wasn't about her talent, it was about how American she sounded. And if she didn't sound American enough, she wasn't trusted with serious parts. This wasn't a silent policy either. Public interviews and studio press kits often used her voice as a gimmick. The studios leaned on her image as an exotic foreigner. They sold her movies based on that image and marketed her more like a cartoon than a person. She wasn't the only actor treated this way, but she was one of the most visible. Lupe had star power, and audiences liked her. But the studio heads didn't let that translate into creative control. She had to walk a narrow line between giving the studios what they wanted and keeping her dignity intact. The pressure to perform a certain way didn't come from fans, it came from the system, and every time she stepped on set, she had to choose. Push back and risk losing the job, or go along with the stereotype and hope it might lead to something better later. Off-screen, Lupe tried to show a different side of herself. She gave interviews in fluent English. She spoke about her work seriously. She talked about wanting to play different roles that weren't just angry girlfriends or dramatic dancers. But those comments rarely made the headlines. The papers preferred her outbursts, her laughter, her flirtation. They wanted to keep her in a box, and the studios didn't stop them. In a way, she was one of the earliest examples of a Latina actress trying to navigate a system that wanted her presence but not her voice. And even though the Mexican Spitfire character brought in money, it came at a personal cost. Stuck between elegance and stereotype. At the time, the studio systems didn't just market actresses, they built their entire image. Dolores Del Rio was introduced to American audiences as high-class and dignified. Her look was soft and carefully styled. She rarely raised her voice in films, and when she did, it was elegant and controlled. Lupe had energy, and the studios didn't know what to do with it. The Mexican Spitfire label had stuck with her for the rest of her career. In interviews, movie posters, and publicity photos, Lupe was made to look impulsive, wild, and dramatic. Instead of soft gowns, she was often styled in exaggerated costumes. Instead of graceful silence, she was cast in roles where she yelled, cried, or stomped across the screen. This contrast was no accident. Hollywood had created a split identity between its two most famous Mexican stars. Dolores was what the industry considered safe. She fit the mold of a European-style beauty. Lupe was fiery and difficult. Critics described Lupe's performances as undignified. They said she was too loud, too expressive, too much. But what they really meant was that she didn't behave the way they expected. She didn't stay quiet. She didn't follow the script written for women who looked like her. And they punished her for that. While Dolores was offered roles that showed grace and poise, Lupe was handed parts that made her the punchline. In the 1930s, Lupe's Mexican Spitfire character became the center of a whole film series. These movies leaned hard into stereotypes. Her character was hot-tempered, jealous, loud, and quick to cause a scene. Audiences laughed at her, but rarely with her. The series made money, but it also cemented her in a role that gave her little respect. It made her name famous, but it didn't help her get taken seriously. Studio executives wanted to control Lupe's image, but she pushed back. She had her own ideas. She spoke directly to reporters, answered questions without a filter, and didn't soften her accent or personality. This independence made her even more of a target. Her refusal to fit the mold only strengthened the industry's idea that she was out of control. Behind the scenes, Lupe worked just as hard as any other star. The press didn't care about her professionalism or preparation. They only focused on her outbursts, her wardrobe choices, or her supposed rivalries with other actresses. Even the few times she did something quiet or graceful, the coverage ignored it. Reporters preferred drama. A quiet night at home wasn't interesting. A story about Lupe yelling in public? That sold papers. She couldn't win. If she acted wild, they mocked her. If she acted calm, they ignored her. Some film historians have pointed out that the industry used Lupe to create a caricature of Mexican women. She was made to represent an entire culture, but only through a narrow and distorted lens. That version of her stuck. Years later, long after her final film, people still referred to her as the Spitfire instead of her real name. Dolores Del Rio, meanwhile, was allowed to evolve. She returned to Mexico, worked with respected directors, and reshaped her career. Lupe didn't get that opportunity. The labels placed on her were too heavy. She had no room to grow. And while Hollywood limited her on-screen, the tabloids took over off-screen, turning her personal life into a circus. Lupe became less of a person and more of a headline, her name tangled in rumors, romances, and relentless speculation. The men, the myths, the media. She dated some of the biggest names in Hollywood, and every name brought fresh gossip. Her most talked about relationship was with actor Gary Cooper. It was intense, loud, and very public. They argued often, sometimes in front of others, which gave the press even more fuel. When the relationship ended, the coverage didn't. Some reports made it seem like Lupe had spiraled out of control after the breakup, which only added to the narrative that she was unstable and dramatic. They painted her as jealous, wild, and overly emotional. If a man left her or cheated on her, it wasn't the man who was shamed, it was Lupe who got branded as difficult. The press spun stories about how she would lash out, how she couldn't handle rejection, how she created chaos wherever she went. What made things worse was the racial angle. As one of the few Mexican stars in Hollywood, Lupe was often described in loaded language. Words like fiery, spicy, and hot-blooded followed her in articles and gossip columns. These terms weren't just cliches, they were weapons. The media used them to push the idea that Lupe couldn't control herself. That idea stuck and shaped how the public saw her, even when there was no real drama happening at all. Her relationships weren't always chaotic, but that wasn't the version people wanted to hear. Quiet nights at home didn't sell papers, so instead the stories focused on love triangles, arguments, and broken promises. Even her rumored jealousy became a character trait the press played up. If another woman talked to her boyfriend, the tabloids ran wild with stories about Lupe plotting revenge. These weren't facts. They were fantasies dressed up as truth, repeated enough times to become part of her reputation. And the sad part? It started to overshadow her work. She had made it big in an industry that didn't make space for women like her. But that part of the story was often lost in the noise. Her talent, her hustle, and her impact were buried under layers of gossip. When people talked about Lupe, they didn't mention her timing on screen or her ability to hold an audience. They asked about the latest rumor, the latest man, the latest fight. It wasn't just the American press either. Even in Latin America, coverage of Lupe became a mix of pride and pity. Some writers called her a disgrace for how she lived, others blamed Hollywood for corrupting her. Her image became a tug-of-war between cultures, with the truth somewhere in between. Lupe's personal life became a product. And once she was labeled the Mexican Spitfire, everything she did had to fit the script. If she showed emotion, it proved the stereotype. If she stayed quiet, they said she was fuming beneath the surface. She couldn't win either way. Even her love letters, when leaked or quoted, were turned into punchlines. Moments that were deeply personal were turned into tabloid gold. No one stopped to ask how it felt to be reduced to a headline. No one cared about the pressure or the toll it took. The constant coverage didn't just affect her image, it shaped how she saw herself. She once said she felt like she had to perform even off-screen. She couldn't just be Lupe, she had to be Lupe Velez, the name people expected drama from. That kind of pressure builds over time. It gets heavy, and there's no easy way to drop it. Still, Lupe didn't disappear under the weight of the headlines. She kept working, fighting for space in an industry that was changing fast and leaving stars like her behind. The spotlight dimmed, but she refused to step off the stage. A star holding on in a changing industry. By the early 1940s, the Mexican Spitfire film series was a big part of that visibility. The films were lighthearted comedies built around Lupe's fiery personality and strong on-screen energy. They leaned into a caricature that audiences had come to expect from her. Quick-tempered, passionate, unpredictable. These movies weren't made to win awards or get critics talking, but they sold tickets. That mattered. They were box office hits, reliable moneymakers for the studio, and a steady paycheck for Lupe. She played Carmelita Lindsay, a Mexican woman married to an American businessman, caught in constant comic misunderstandings with his family and friends. It wasn't exactly groundbreaking material, but Lupe delivered the role with the same explosive charm she had in her earlier years. The character was loud, funny, and fast-talking. The audience loved it. Studios saw the money coming in and kept producing sequel after sequel. The films were cheap to make. RKO reused sets, stuck to a formula, and kept the runtime short. Lupe didn't mind. She wasn't being offered glamorous, dramatic leads like she had in the silent era or her early talkies, but she wasn't begging for work either. The studios still needed her, even if it was in a narrow lane. The Mexican Spitfire films gave her the kind of job security many of her peers had lost by that point in their careers. Behind the scenes, Lupe was aware of the typecasting. She had always pushed back against being seen as a stereotype, but she also knew how Hollywood worked. The studios wanted her to be one thing, and she had figured out how to make that work for her as long as possible. Playing the same role over and over didn't give her much creative freedom, but it gave her control over her finances and kept her name in the trades. The Spitfire films also kept her popular with American audiences, even as Hollywood's tastes were starting to shift. New faces were appearing, wartime movies were taking over, the industry's focus was moving in a different direction. Stars who didn't adapt fast enough were being replaced, but Lupe stayed visible. The roles might not have been her dream parts, but she was still working, she was still being paid, and she was still recognized on the street. The later entries in the Mexican Spitfire series weren't as sharp as the first few. Some critics started to grow tired of the formula, and even fans admitted the humor was starting to wear thin. But for Lupe, the films were a lifeline. They kept her anchored during a time when many other silent-era stars had completely vanished from the public eye. She had a fan base, she had contracts, she had a house in Beverly Hills. For someone who had come from post-revolutionary Mexico and built a name in a deeply racist industry, that counted as a win. She wasn't leading highbrow dramas anymore, but she was still here, still part of the machine. Behind the humor and fast-paced dialogue, though, there was a shift happening. Hollywood was making room for new stars. Younger actresses were being pushed to the front. Ethnic characters were still on screen, but now often played by white actors in darker makeup. The studio system was becoming more corporate and less personal. The roles being offered to Lupe were shrinking, not completely, but noticeably. Still, the work kept coming. Lupe had something many others didn't: recognition. Even in a changing industry, she had name value. People remembered her. She had stayed relevant longer than most. Not because the system made it easy for her, but because she kept showing up and performing with everything she had. That's the part people often overlook. When the roles stopped evolving, Lupe didn't step away. She held her ground and played the game the way it was handed to her. But while Lupe managed to survive the industry's shifts, what came next was something no career could shield her from: a love story that broke everything. In late 1944, she had just announced her engagement to Austrian actor Harold Ramonde. It should have been a happy time, a step toward settling down, but instead it opened the door to one of the most painful chapters of her life. Harold wasn't a major star, but he had enough presence to catch attention, and Lupe's. The press ran stories of the two together, often painting it like a whirlwind romance. At first, it seemed like a real match. They were both actors. They shared a social circle. They looked good together in photos. But the real story was already unraveling behind closed doors. Lupe was pregnant. That wasn't a detail she kept hidden for long. She told close friends. She even made it public shortly after the engagement. But what didn't go public, at least not right away, was how Ramonde responded to the news. He didn't want to go through with the marriage. Whether it was fear, pressure, or some other reason, he backed out. Just days after Lupe made her announcement, the engagement was off. No ceremony, no baby plans, no future. Just silence from Harold and confusion from the public. For Lupe, the blow hit hard. She was raised Catholic. Her belief system didn't allow for much flexibility when it came to motherhood outside of marriage. Her public image didn't either. She was still known for fiery roles, but off-screen, she had worked hard to stay in good standing with the press. A scandal like this could ruin everything, and unlike many of her white Hollywood peers, she didn't have the kind of power that let her quietly navigate these moments behind studio walls. Every mistake would be held against her tenfold. There were ways she could have handled it, of course. One idea was to leave the country, have the child in Mexico, and come back pretending it had been adopted. It wasn't uncommon in old Hollywood. Some stars got away with it. But for Lupe, it still felt like betrayal to her religion, to her sense of identity, and to the idea of being genuinely loved. She wasn't just trying to avoid gossip. She was holding on to something more personal. The feeling that someone had promised her a future and taken it away overnight. The press made it worse. When the engagement fell apart, they didn't blame Harold. They turned the spotlight on Lupe. Rumors spread that she was too emotional, too unstable, too difficult to love. The same papers that had printed glowing reviews of her films were now suggesting she was desperate to hold on to any man. They mocked her, often using racially charged language and offensive stereotypes. It wasn't just about a failed relationship, it was character assassination. The heartbreak didn't stay private for long. Friends close to her noticed a shift. She had always been emotional, always dramatic, but now it was sharper. She looked tired. She spoke less. She still worked, still appeared in public, still smiled for the cameras, but behind that, things were crumbling. One friend later said that Lupe talked about feeling stuck. There was no clear way forward. She couldn't have the child without a scandal. She couldn't give it up without guilt, and she couldn't forgive the man who had walked away from the life they were supposed to build together. What made things worse was how quickly people moved on. Ramon disappeared from the picture. The studio system didn't step in. No one came forward to defend her or try to fix what had happened. Lupe was alone with a choice that didn't have a good outcome. It wasn't just the end of a relationship, it was the start of a quiet collapse. She had survived scandals before, had dealt with gossip, and had faced public embarrassment. But this felt like something different. It wasn't just her reputation at risk, it was her future, her child's future, her ability to walk through a crowd without being reminded of what she had lost. In the final days, the spotlight faded into shadows. Friends noticed the change, less fire, more fragility. And on one quiet night in Beverly Hills, the woman who had once lit up every room chose to be alone with her thoughts, her fears, and her final goodbye. The last night in Beverly Hills. On the evening of December 13, 1944, Lupe Velez invited two of her closest friends over to her Beverly Hills home. The house, tucked away behind palm-lined gates, was quiet that night. Her first guest stayed only for a while, leaving Lupe and her second friend, Estelle Taylor, alone in the later hours. Estelle would later say Lupe was behaving normally, but behind her bright smile and sharp wit, something was clearly off. By the time the clock edged toward 3:30 in the morning, Estelle was preparing to head home. Lupe pulled her aside and told her something that shifted the mood instantly. She said she was afraid, not of someone, not of danger, just life. She confessed she was expecting a baby and felt completely lost. Her words were soft but final. Estelle left with those words still ringing in her ears. The next morning, December 14th, Beulah Kinder arrived at the house. She had been working as Lupe's personal secretary and friend, so showing up early wasn't unusual. But the silence inside the house felt heavier than usual. She moved through the hallway, calling out Lupe's name. When there was no answer, she pushed open the door to Lupe's bedroom. What she found was a quiet, staged scene. Lupe was lying on her bed, dressed in her silk nightclothes. Her body was perfectly still. Her head rested on a blue satin pillow. Her hands were folded over her chest. Next to her lay an empty bottle of sleeping pills. Beulah stood frozen for a moment before calling the police. When the authorities arrived, they quickly secured the room. The first officer on the scene described Lupe as looking like a doll, too delicate for the large bed she was on. Her hair had been freshly dyed. Her makeup was carefully applied. Everything in the room seemed deliberate. On the nightstand, officers found two handwritten notes. One was addressed to her former fiancé, Harold Ramon. The letter was filled with pain and betrayal. She asked God to forgive both of them. She said she saw no other way out. She couldn't bring herself to bring shame upon her child or face the world alone. She ended it by telling Harold goodbye and wishing him good luck. The second note was for Beulah. It was shorter, but deeply personal. Lupe thanked her for her loyalty and asked her to take care of her own mother. She also thanked the American press for being kind to her, leaving behind no trace of bitterness. She wanted someone to understand why she made this choice, and Beulah was the only person she trusted with that. The police confirmed that no one else had entered or exited the house that night. There was no forced entry, no struggle, no sign of foul play. The official report ruled it as death by overdose. Her body was taken for examination. The results lined up with everything found at the scene. Estelle, in later interviews, would revisit that final conversation. She said Lupe wasn't hysterical. She wasn't crying. She was calm. The fear in her voice wasn't about one single event. It was about everything piling up over time. It was the end of something she couldn't name out loud. News of her death spread quickly. Reporters gathered outside the home by the dozens. Fans were stunned. Lupe had just finished another installment in her popular Mexican Spitfire series. She was still appearing in magazines. People didn't expect someone so visible to vanish so suddenly. As the press started gathering details, they confirmed that she had made dinner plans for the following week. She had modeling appointments scheduled, but none of those things mattered anymore. In that quiet room, with only candlelight and shadows as her company, Lupe Velez made her final decision. Twisting the truth, the toilet myth. But 15 years after Lupe Velez's death, a writer named Kenneth Anger rewrote her final moments into something bizarre. In 1959, he published a book called Hollywood Babylon, which was packed with shocking stories about classic stars. Most of the stories were unverified, but that didn't stop people from treating them as facts. In Lupe's case, Anger took the known details of her passing and created a version that was completely false and strangely specific. According to Anger, Lupe didn't die peacefully in her bed from sleeping pills. He claimed she had made herself a spicy Mexican meal before going to bed, then taken the pills. His version said the food and pills didn't mix well, so she became sick during the night, stumbled into the bathroom, slipped, and drowned in the toilet. There was no hesitation in the way he told it. He described the scene like he had seen it himself, even though he hadn't. No police report supported his version. There were no eyewitnesses who said it happened that way. He didn't name a source. Still, people believed it. What made Anger's version so sticky was how vivid and grotesque it was. It was dramatic, it was embarrassing, and it matched the stereotype that had followed Lupe throughout her life. The story gave the public an image they couldn't ignore, a glamorous woman who supposedly died in the most humiliating way imaginable. It didn't help that he filled the description with extra details, like how the smell of candles and roses, almost but not quite, covered up the odor of the scene. He painted it like a gothic horror story, but his only evidence was his own imagination. The strangest part is that Anger admitted in interviews that he often used what he called mental telepathy to get his stories. That's how he said he knew the details. He didn't pretend he had police records or access to secret files. He just made the story fit what he thought people would find interesting. He never expected readers to fact-check him, and back then, they couldn't. There were no photos published from the scene. No original documents were made public. All people had was what he told them. What's even more damaging is how Anger's version shaped the way people remembered her. Instead of being remembered as a groundbreaking Mexican-American star, she became a cautionary tale. His book turned her personal tragedy into entertainment. And because Hollywood Babylon was popular, especially with people who were fascinated by celebrity scandals, the damage spread fast. Even when researchers and historians later pointed out that the story had no basis, the lie had already done its job. The real reports from the time of her death described a different scene entirely. Her friend and secretary found her in her bed with her head resting on a satin pillow. There were no reports of vomit trails, no references to the bathroom. But that version didn't make headlines. It wasn't messy enough for gossip. The real Lupe Velez was known for her energy, her fiery personality, and her screen presence. But that version of her, complicated and human, was pushed aside to make room for a cartoon version that people could laugh at or whisper about. Kenneth Anger didn't just invent a story, he rewired the way people thought about her, and he did it without any need for truth. There was something especially cruel about the way this myth caught on. It took the last few hours of her life and turned them into a public joke. He gave no thought to her family or friends who were still alive when he published the story. He didn't care how it might affect her memory. The point wasn't to honor her life, it was to sell books, and it worked. To make it worse, this lie didn't stay buried in the pages of a scandalous book. It took on a life of its own, turned into a joke by pop culture. By the time the real Lupe Velez faded from public memory, her legacy had already been hijacked. TV shows, late-night comedians, and films didn't care about the truth. They cared about the version of her that sounded bizarre, shocking, and easy to laugh at. One quick joke could erase an entire career, and Lupe became that joke. Writers in Hollywood used her name like it meant nothing. On sitcoms, her death was thrown into scripts with no context, just a strange punchline for the audience to chuckle at. In the pilot episode of Frasier, two characters discuss her as if she were a tabloid character. The real person behind the name didn't matter. There was no mention of her films, her impact, or what she'd gone through. Just a recycled version of the false story that got passed around like gossip. Outside of TV, tour buses in Los Angeles added her house to their routes, but not to admire her career. It was listed for shock value. Guides would point to the property, lower their voices, and say something dramatic. Tourists would react, some laughed, some didn't know who she was. But what stuck in their memory wasn't her work or talent, it was the made-up bathroom story that had been sold for years. As more movies and books tried to sound edgy, her name kept showing up in scenes that had nothing to do with her real life. The character of Lupe was used to represent chaos, sadness, or dramatic failure. She wasn't seen as a person anymore. She was seen as a cautionary tale, or worse, a punchline. The false version of her death kept resurfacing in jokes, skits, and even online message boards, where it became a piece of Hollywood trivia no one bothered to question. Even animated shows took part. In The Simpsons, there's an episode where a character casually points to a toilet and claims it's the one Lupe drowned in. It was said like a fun fact. The audience laughed because they were trained to laugh. No one paused to ask if it was real. The show didn't make up the rumor. It was just echoing what people already thought. By then, her death had been retold so many times that even the wildest versions sounded normal. For decades, people believed she died in a way she didn't. Some even thought it was ironic or darkly funny. That became her image, the glamorous starlet who tripped over her own life in the final scene. But that version was written by someone else, not by Lupe. She never got to write her own ending. Others wrote it for her, then sold it, quoted it, and joked about it. The saddest part is how long it lasted. Even after new generations came along, the joke was still being told. She was reduced to a trivia line. The emotional weight of her final days was erased by the need for shock value. Her real life didn't fit the joke, so people chose the story that did. Her home, once a private space where she tried to build a future, turned into a tourist spectacle. People would stand outside, take pictures, and whisper to each other, not because they cared about who she was, but because they had heard the story somewhere. It was the same story told in Hollywood Babylon and recycled in pop culture year after year. That's how fast a life can be rewritten. Lupe Velez, the woman who broke into Hollywood at a time when few Mexican actors were even allowed through the door, became a myth. And not the kind you build statues for, the kind you turn into a joke. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments down below.